speaker tonight, but before I do that, I just want to briefly note that the Sustainable Future Speaker Series is something we do every semester. We've got a good lineup of speakers this fall. This is a jointly organized, jointly funded series between the Environment and Community Master's Program and the Schatz Energy Research Center. The next speaker in the series is Shankoff. Will be speaking on September 24th. The title of his talk is The Environmental, Public Health, and Climate Dimensions of Oil and Gas Development in California. Should be a really interesting one, and hope people will turn out. On October 8th, Jack West will be speaking. He's an alum of HSU and one of the co-founders of Solar. Title of his talk is The PV Industry and Insiders' Insights into the Evolution of PV Technology and Business Models. Then on October 22nd, Charles Wilkinson will be presenting. Title of his talk is From Humboldt Bay to the Columbia to the Canadian Line, How Northwest Tribes Triumphed in the Courts and Changed the World. November 5th, Harsha Walia will be speaking, Undoing Border Imperialism. And on November 12th, Sarah Ray, who's a professor here at HSU, Can a Green University Serve Underrepresented Students? Reconciling Sustainability and Diversity at HSU. So it should be, I think, a really exciting lineup. I hope people will come out. All of the talks are on Thursdays and in this room from 5:30 to 7. I'd now like to introduce our speaker for tonight. I'm really pleased to have Matthew Marshall here with us. I think Matthew is developing a track record as being one of the most frequent speakers in our series. You've spoken
this might be the third time, yeah.
Third time, that's awesome. And that's because Matthew has so much interesting to say about clean energy and sustainability issues here in our region. He's the executive director of the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, which implements a number of energy efficiency programs in our region, and is also involved in a host of initiatives related to clean transportation, renewable energy. Matthew will outline a bit of that in his talk. Matthew's also been involved in sustainability and clean energy and greenhouse gas mitigation efforts in other venues, most notably for the city of Denver for a number of years. He's an alum of HSU. Please join me in giving him a very warm welcome.
Thanks, Arnie, and I guess it's good to be the first speaker of the year, so that there hasn't been a bar set that that I can be below. So
the bar has been set by all of your prior times.
Oh, okay.
So it's very high.
So I'm going to be talking today about a system called community choice aggregation and what we're doing locally to potentially implement a community choice program. I'm going to start off though by providing some a little bit of context just to kind of set the stage, which kind of keeps me grounded in like why are we doing all this, and talk a little bit about where we're at right now and kind of some of the work that's taken place so far and kind of gotten us to where we're at, and then how that leads into what community choice is and why we might want to do it here in Humboldt County. So just a little bit about the Redwood Coast Energy Authority. We're a local government joint powers agency, so we represent the county and all the incorporated cities in the county as well as the Humboldt Bay Water District. We were formed back in 2003 to really be a shared agency amongst those government entities to work on sustainable energy initiatives on their behalf. And so we're based in Eureka, and we work on a range of initiatives. From energy efficiency has really been our bread and butter over the years, but also looking at sustainable transportation and renewable energy. And we partner certainly with the Schatz Energy Research Center and HSU on a daily basis on numerous projects. And so our mission has really been to look at what can we do locally as a community to move sustainability forward. So just to I always like to kind of preface it and maybe get on the soapbox a little bit of the purpose for a lot of the things we're doing is really to address climate change and CO2 emissions, and looking at how can we sort of transition out of fossil fuels, which is a limited resource that isn't going to last forever, and what's that transition look like? And to sort of set the stage, I often think back to one of the things Arnie didn't mention was my undergraduate degree from HSU is actually in art, and I started out as a high school teacher, and for reasons that I won't get into, I ended up teaching some science and math classes. And one of those classes was an environmental science class. We were kind of talking, about a range of issues locally, up to kind of global environmental issues. And I remember because I would show this video series, and this was back in the early 2000s, I don't know, 2002, 2003, something like that. And I would show this video series that was made in Canada, and it had Alanis Morissette and Keanu Reeves were like the narrators. I don't know if they're Canadian or something, but they were kind of the voiceovers, and it was a well done little mini documentary series. But I always think back to that because they talked about like, well, gosh, what if we don't do something about climate change? What are the potential impacts that we could see at some future point in time? So one of the things that they talked to people in New Orleans and said, there could be an increase in catastrophic hurricanes that could impact coastal communities, as well as, combining that with sea level rise could really be detrimental to coastal communities, across the globe. They talked about the potential for warmer winters to increase like beetle kill in trees because the cold weather kind of suppresses their reproductive cycle, and without really cold winters, you can have explosions of beetle kill in western forests, and that could, have ecological consequences and then forest fire consequences. And they talked about, there was always the dream of the Northwest Passage and the, getting around northern Canada because the ice has melted enough. And they said, gosh, if we actually, have ice, pack melting in the Arctic to the extent that someday we might actually have a Northwest Passage. And so those were kind of their like doomsday future possible scenarios. And as many of you probably know, that all of those things have happened. Not that you can tie any particular hurricane or particular hot weather spell to climate change, but it's like being overweight, and you can't say, well, that person's going to have a heart attack tomorrow because they're overweight. But you can say, well, if you look at the numbers, there's more likely that if you've got high blood pressure and high cholesterol, that eventually the odds are against you. And so obviously, Hurricane Katrina made that piece of that video come true. And if anyone's flown over the, the Rocky Mountains recently, there's just, thousands upon thousands of dead trees, that, when I was in Colorado, that was a major concern. And then that fuels, forest fire, which obviously releases more carbon into the atmosphere. And without even the beetle kill component of it, obviously forest fires can become an issue, as we're seeing locally. And then the Northwest Passage has actually been open, since then. And so it's one of those things where it's like, okay, we're starting to not just say, oh, this could happen, but these things actually, since I was a high school teacher, my videos are out of date, and I'm not that old. And so those things that we were anticipating actually have happened. And so, the question is, so what can we do? And that's, my students asked me that back then. And so, California is certainly a leader in trying to address sustainable energy. And I think locally, we're a small piece of the puzzle, but we, first of all, can just, take responsibility for our own energy use and say, how can we, be, responsible for our own house? And then how can we also be, perhaps a test bed and saying, hey, this is how you can push the limits in a community. And this is how you can kind of push forward and have sustainability both from an environmental and an economic standpoint, and be somewhat of an example, hopefully, if we can achieve that. So the kind of context of like where are we at today, and I always put this up there because we spend about over $400 million per year in Humboldt County on energy, and a big part of that is transportation. And if you do the greenhouse gas emissions, that transportation slice of the wedge gets much larger. So that's really one of the key challenges we have to overcome is transportation emissions. But we're spending quite a bit of money on energy, and that generally is leaving the community in the form of utility bills, or buying gasoline. There isn't a lot of that that's locally produced. We'll talk about some of it that is. And so that's a big chunk of economic activity that potentially can be leveraged for local benefits. If you look at our kind of physical situation, that we live in a kind of an energy island or an energy peninsula to some extent, and so there's two major transmission lines that feed Humboldt County, and then there's one natural gas pipeline that comes into the community. And those two transmission lines, their usable capacity is about 70 megawatts, which is about our base load of power, and our peaks, up more like 170. So we really need local generation to meet our local needs. There isn't even the infrastructure really to feed that into the community, and so we're dependent on local generation within our community. And obviously that creates energy security issues. If there's an earthquake, or in the case of recently, fires can cause damage to those kind of tenuous infrastructure sort of arteries that come into our community, and then our petroleum products are predominantly barged into the bay as far as gas and diesel. So if you look at our electricity generation locally, and this is for 2010, and I'll talk a little bit more where we're at today, but a significant chunk of actually what's being generated locally is from local biomass plants. There's 3 of them out in Fairhaven, and then down in Scotia and Blue Lake. There's a chunk that's imported, and then there's some hydropower, there's some photovoltaic, which is growing, and then there's the Humboldt Bay natural gas power plant. And so that's kind of, traditionally for quite some time, that's been sort of the picture of where energy's come from, as far as, you turn on the light, that's what's powering your light socket. And so a few years back, the Schatz Energy Research Center, as well as PG&E, partnered with the Energy Authority to say, okay, how can we kind of push the envelope? And we undertook a project called RePower Humboldt to look at, is it feasible to get 75 to maybe up towards 100% of our local electricity needs met from local resources? And on top of that, could we even look at switching other fuels that create emissions, like natural gas and transportation fuels in particular, to that local renewable sources as well? And so the project was, over a number of years, and it really looked at taking kind of what's the sort of available resources we have in our community. So there's, some potential for offshore wind, offshore wave, some onshore wind. There's existing facilities. There's the potential for new facilities, in solar, hydro, biomass. And so the folks at the Schatz Energy Research Center did a copious amount of pretty detailed modeling of looking at those resources, looking at our load. And I'm not going to get into a bunch of detail here, but that black line is basically, this is a little sample, week in time, and that's sort of the energy load that, we need to meet with local resources, and then that, the resources that in this particular model run were available, to meet that need. And sometimes there's a little bit more, sometimes there's less, and that gets filled in with the natural gas and red. And so they did, quite a bit of modeling to say, is it actually possible to combine these local resources that we have in some combination to match up that load that we have? Or are we going to need tons of storage? It's just like with solar. It's like, okay, if you just did solar, obviously the sun goes down, and you say, well, okay, we're going to have storage. And so can we balance that out? And so the bottom line was that it is feasible, which was not something that was necessarily expected to be the outcome. And that it would take a portfolio of strategies. There's not one silver bullet technology. But there's significant opportunities around biomass. There's opportunities around wind, solar, energy efficiency, and reducing transportation emissions through electric vehicles. We're kind of highly competitive from a greenhouse gas reduction standpoint as far as cost savings and reducing emissions. I always feel the caveat to say the best thing you can do to reduce emissions is ride your bike. But as far as looking at the fuels we're using, there was this portfolio of options that really kind of said, oh, we could do this locally. And so the next step of that is, well, okay, let's move forward and see how we could do that. And I think we're making some good progress on numerous fronts. On the efficiency side, there's locally about $3 million a year in funding that's now going to energy efficiency programs in various ways. And so that's maybe not enough, but it's a definite push forward on the efficiency front. On the renewable side, we've been doing a lot of work with the Schatz Energy Research Center on sort of pilot projects around community scale renewables, working with the Blue Lake Rancheria on small scale biomass facility work. And there's a new project that the Schatz Lab is working with the Rancheria on to look at a microgrid system, and so kind of trying to make some definite sort of R&D progress on sort of both the programmatic side as well as the technology side. And then on the electric vehicle side, there's definitely been some solid progress. We've been doing a lot of both planning work and now really kind of implementing that planning work. And here this is a graph of electric vehicle sales in Humboldt County, and it's really been picking up. And we actually have the 3rd highest per capita electric vehicle sales in the entire United States in Humboldt County. And so the community's really been saying, hey, this is something that makes sense from an economic standpoint as well as a performance standpoint and an environmental standpoint. So we've been doing pretty good on numerous fronts. Where there hasn't been such great progress and we've had some setbacks is going back to the electricity generation side of it, that in the last couple of years, rather than making large steps forward in this, we've actually had 2 of the biomass plants idled this summer because they didn't have contracts. And the hydro plant up on Reef Lake that the water district owns is considering shutting down because it's difficult for the economics to work out for them. And the reason for a lot of that is that the price of our local renewables is a little bit higher, and the contract terms that are available, were not workable for those plants, or is really kind of a stretch for the water district. And that just has to do with what the price of renewables are across the state and what our local conditions are. And so there's kind of a question of, well, okay, that's not a step in the right direction. What can we do about that? And another setback was there was a proposed wind project down in Bear River Ridge, which would have been a 50 megawatt wind project, which is it's a pretty high, the intensity of the wind there is quite good, even at a statewide level. So there's a lot of opportunity there. That project was led by Shale Energy Solutions, who isn't everyone's favorite company, and for economic reasons they pulled back as it wasn't going to pencil out for them. It wasn't worth their while. The community down in Ferndale had a lot of skepticism about working with a large oil company, and they kind of approached it like a large oil company. And so that project didn't happen either. And so, there's kind of been on the utility generation side of it, we haven't really been getting a lot of traction there. And so, this kind of brings us to community choice aggregation and looking at ways, well, how can we as a community take a more active role, and rather than saying, let's wait for Shell or some other company to develop a project, or let's hope PG&E or some other utility wants to contract with our local plants to keep them open, how can we take a more active role in moving things forward at the utility level? And community choice aggregation is really kind of a key potential tool for us to do that. And so what is CCA? It's got a horrible name, and so I think people are trying to switch to community choice energy or community choice something other than aggregation. But it's a system that enables local governments to aggregate electricity demand within their jurisdictions in order to procure alternative energy supplies while maintaining the existing electricity provider for transmission and distribution services. So what on earth does that mean? So if you look at the system we have right now, there's kind of 3 key components of electricity services. And so, with an investor-owned utility model, which is what we have with PG&E, they go out and procure power, either through their own power plants, but typically they contract for power with producers. Then they maintain and manage the transmission distribution system to get that power from where it's generated to your home or your business. And then they provide the customer service. They come out and fix your meter if it breaks, and they switch your service, and they do all the billing, and they take care of whatever state taxes and fees, and manage the customer interface side of that. So there's also municipal or public utilities or rural co-ops in some areas where a local government entity basically does all those functions. So Trinity County has a public utility district. City of Ukiah, City of Reading have municipal utilities, and so it's a similar model, except it's a local government entity that's operating those. And there's hundreds of these across the country, and they typically have lower rates than investor-owned utilities because they don't have investors and a profit margin, and there's other reasons as well, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And so community choice aggregation is really a hybrid between those two, where the local government's taking on that power procurement piece of it, but then the incumbent utility, PG&E in our case, continues to take care of the transmission distribution, still is doing the billing. And so it's really, if you look at your bill, there's about half of it is the generation component, and the rest of it is transmission distribution, taxes and fees, and nuclear decommissioning, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is really just saying, okay, the local government's taking responsibility for that generation component of it. And this is not an untypical scenario for, even in California, on a large commercial customer basis. HSU, in fact, does this very thing through a third-party provider where they actually don't buy their electricity. HSU does not buy its electricity from PG&E. They buy it from a different company, and then they still are obviously getting it delivered to the doorstep of HSU by PG&E. And so it's a similar model to that, but instead of a campus, it's a community-wide approach to that, a city or multiple cities in a county. And so there's only two, now about to be three really, operating CCAs in California, but there's actually over 1,000 across the country, and it's quite common in Illinois and Ohio, and has been around for a couple decades, almost on the East Coast. And a big driver of it in some of those other areas is really cost savings, and they can typically, I think in Illinois they have like 20% is the average cost savings, and so it's not a new thing in the country, and there's multiple states that if we were doing developing CCA programs, this would be kind of light blue in here and light blue up there. So it's expanding across the country, but even in existing CCAs, though it's a fairly new phenomenon in California, it's been around the country. It's not something that's uncommon or rare. And again, there's also the parallel to municipal utilities, which are doing what CCAs do, plus all the transmission distribution. So it's something that's certainly feasible for local governments to do from a technical implementation standpoint. And so why would we want to do this? I mentioned the rate savings, but that's for some folks a key driver. In some other states that hasn't been kind of the primary motivation locally or in California. But I think one of the key things is having competitive rates that are equal or below what people are already paying is kind of a really important component of it, and that potential has merit just on its own. There's a local control standpoint in that you get to set your own local priorities, and so as a community we can say this is what we want to do in our community to power our homes and our businesses. These are the kinds of projects we do want, the kinds of projects we don't want. There's local rate setting to balance those priorities, and it's not happening down at the CPUC in San Francisco where you have to be an intervener on some rate case. You can go down to a public meeting and give your 2 cents to an elected official and say, hey, this is my thoughts on what our power mix should be or how this should function. And then the choice part of it is critical. So if you start a community choice program in a community, it becomes the default option. So everyone will be automatically opted into the CCA program unless they choose to opt out. And so as an individual business or an individual home, you can choose to opt out of the program and say, you know what, I don't trust the government, or I don't like the sound of this, or I think my rates are going to go up even though the rate comparison from PG&E and the CCA program says it's not. So people can opt out, and they can even opt out at a later date as well. And so it really does create a choice from the customer standpoint in that they can stick with what they've got right now, and there's no impact to the customer from doing that, or they can go with the new program, and so it really is creating two options where historically there's really just been one. And so looking at some of the programs, the two programs that have really been up and running in California, Marin Clean Energy was the first, and they began serving customers about 5 years ago, and they actually have a 50% renewable energy as their sort of base option. And for reference, PG&E is in the 20-25% range right now, and so around double what PG&E is offering. And then they have rates that are 2 to 5% lower than PG&E, depending on if you're a commercial or residential customer. And so they've been able to kind of you could say have their cake and eat it too, and that they've pushed the envelope a bit on the renewable percentage and still are maintaining lower rates. Sonoma, a little closer, began serving customers in early 2014, and they rolled out with a 33% renewable base option, which is the state target for 2020. The state target's perhaps going to be 50% renewables for 2030, but they rolled out with that kind of right out of the gate, trying to hit that 2030 target, and their rates are around 7% or so below PG&E across the board. And so one of the questions I've gotten is, well, how is that possible that PG&E is this big company with all this buying power, and these little startup entities are able to have more renewables and lower prices at the same time? And so one point I kind of wanted to just touch on a little micro bit of Humboldt utility history. So in 1883, the first electric lighting was turned on in Humboldt, which was at a mill. And most of the power in the early days was all from mills, and this was particularly lighting at a mill. Somewhere not in Humboldt County, PG&E was founded around 1905. And then in 1911, 1912, the Western State Electric Company became the sole power provider, so they basically bought out the other electricity companies. And they were kind of all these like little mini utilities where there'd be a mill and there'd be like wires going out from that mill to like nearby buildings, so like the Vance mill powered the Vance Hotel. And so it was 1911 when it basically became a monopoly in Humboldt County, as far as there was one company that owned all the generation and distribution. And then in 1927, PG&E bought out Western State and became the incumbent utility that they have been ever since. And so I bring that up in the sense that investor-owned utilities, where they operate, have been, in the case of PG&E, a regulated monopoly for around 100 years, or more than 100 years in PG&E's case. And so, they're highly regulated by the state because they have, they're a for-profit company that basically has no competition. And so, if your choice is to have your lights turned off or to pay them, obviously that creates a challenge to manage what's a reasonable profit for their shareholders, and how do you maintain equitable service in that kind of a monopoly scenario. And so they have a pretty heavy regulatory burden to justify whatever their costs are, and and that's not inexpensive. And so that high overhead and those regulatory costs, they're a big company that has large CEO salaries, and they don't make profit from selling electricity. That's not really their business model, but and they're incentivized not to do that in California. But they do have a pretty high level of overhead, and they're based in San Francisco, where people get paid more and rents are higher, and there's a number of reasons where their costs are just a little bit higher. And then I think the monopoly piece of it comes into not just in their regulatory burden, but in the fact that they haven't had a lot of incentive to innovate or be cost competitive when they had no competition for the last 100 years. And so that's not really an environment that breeds creativity and cost savings and new opportunities. And I think there's a lot of parallels, back when phone companies had sort of monopolies, and there's AT&T, and then you see cellular phones take off, and there'd be much more choice for customers, and it's like, oh, now I can, it doesn't cost me anything extra to call to the East Coast and make a long distance call for 60 minutes, and that's the same as my local calls. And so I think there's advantages for there being a motivation for them to say, oh, if we're going to actually stay in this space of procuring and selling electricity, we're going to have to be more nimble about it, or see customers switch over to a different option. So, I mentioned the rate savings as kind of a potential, and Marin being an example of a couple percent rate savings. And what does that mean in Humboldt? So, taking just the electricity portion of that pie chart I had earlier, we're spending about 143 million or so a year. That's based off of like 2014 numbers, which were a little bit on the low side due to the warm weather. And so, somewhere around 40 to 50% of that is generation. And so that's like $65 million a year. That's actually the generation part. The orange half is transmission, distribution, everything else. And so, assuming some number of, opt-outs from the CCA program, even a 2% rate savings to CCA customers could equal a couple $1 million a year across the community in rate savings. And so, even if that's all we did, we had the same exact mix as PG&E, and we said, oh, but we're going to have 2% lower rates across the board and have an extra $2 million sticking around in the local economy. That's a pretty good reason just right there to consider it as a serious option of something we might want to do. So, where we're at right now, the city of Arcadia, and Michael Winkler in particular, the mayor of Arcadia, has been looking at this for quite some time, and our CEA has also been actively kind of evaluating it for a few years. And that's really picked up, I think, at least on our end, as Marin and Sonoma have kind of shown that it's not just theoretically possible, that it's actually happening in the real world to have these benefits. And so more recently this summer, the Board of Supervisors have unanimously supported the idea of rolling out a CCA program and working through the Energy Authority to work with not just the county but all the cities to hopefully have a community-wide CCA program in Humboldt. And so they've kind of said, hey, let's do that. The devils will be in the details, but there's definite political support at that level. And so I've been going around to all the other cities and kind of getting everyone else up to speed on it. And then my board, which is representatives from the county and then all the city councils, has voted to allocate some resources, not a ton, $125,000 this year out of our general fund, and has directed us to go and start moving things forward to actually take the next steps to launch a local program. So as far as like priorities and saying, well, what do we want to accomplish if we're doing this? There's a lot of choices of how you can structure the program. And so the marching orders I have from my board of directors, and this has been, I think is what resonates also with the Board of Supervisors, and many other folks I've talked to in the community, is really, the first thing is we've got to have some rate savings, and if it's more expensive than what people are paying right now, people are going to choose to opt out just because they're going to look at their bill and say, oh, I don't want it to go up, and the rate shows, the rate comparison says it's going to be more, I'm going to opt out. And so that's kind of we've been operating the assumption like we got to be equal or a little bit below where PG&E is at, or it's just not going to be a viable option. And then the second tier that I think has, just somewhat surprised me a little bit, but for not that much of a surprise, was that they really said, let's focus on local renewable energy resources. And the goal isn't just to, buy power from somewhere else, but, maybe in the short term, that's a big part of it, but really moving towards saying, how can we have this be a vehicle to support local renewable energy generation, to have local environmental benefits, local, energy security, and then a big part of that can also be going into local economic development and using this as a force for economic development. And that goes back to that, hey, if that $65 million a year that we're sending mostly out of the community for generation is sticking around in the community, that's a lot of potential economic activity. And there's other ways we can start looking at keeping more money locally, like the switching to electric vehicles, then saying, oh, now we're powering those locally, and that's going to reduce costs and create more economic development potential. So looking at that local existing renewable generation, and a big piece of it is that that biomass energy, which these numbers are assuming that all three of them are up and running. And so if you look at the local energy load from 2014 and you assume a 20% opt-out rate, you get something around 650,000 megawatt hours a year. The local biomass plants, as well as the water district, the Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District hydro plant, which is only 2 megawatts, so it's a really teeny piece of that. But those three plants, when they were all up and running in 2013, put out a combined somewhere in the range of 330,000 megawatt hours, and you can do the math, and that's getting around 50% of what our load would be, which is great from a local renewable standpoint. It's like, hey, we're going to be at the 2030 goal potentially, right out of the gate at 50% local renewables. The challenge is the local biomass in particular, but any local generation is not necessarily going to be the cheapest power option, and so it's not necessarily going to be easy to make that pencil out in a way that is sustainable for the facilities to operate in a way and do the upgrades that they need to meet air quality compliance standards and to be economically viable, and to also have a rate that can be competitive in the long run with PG&E. So it's not a slam dunk to pull those together. And so I will say that we're the goal is to work aggressively towards that target, but it's really going to start to be it's a pretty close margin there, and I'm going to throw up some numbers that kind of touch on that actually. And so looking at other kinds of resources besides what's existing, one of the things from the RePower Humboldt plan is that biomass isn't just a resource; it's a liability if we don't do something with it. And so that's from an economic development standpoint, having those two facilities closed down impacts like the local mills, for example, in that the one facility that is operating currently can't take all the material that the mills produce, and there was folks that would go out and process green diamond slash and take that to Scotia, and that operation stopped now. Green Diamond's burning that material in the woods. There's the mill waste is a waste product that is now being trucked out of the area because there isn't the local capacity to deal with it. There's no facilities that can take that on, and biomass plants are kind of the bottom feeders of the forest product sector, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in like an ecological way, in the sense that the material that's doesn't have any economic value. It's not good for chips to make pulp paper out of. It's not good for timber. That sort of lowest sort of common denominator material that doesn't have any other economic use is what goes to the biomass plants, and so it's a waste product that without someone to deal with it locally has to be shipped out of the area, just like we truck our trash out of the area. And then on top of that, this map over here is showing, and it's the CAL FIRE's like priority landscapes for fuel reduction. And as you can see, there's a lot of red and there's a lot of orange and and a fair amount of yellow, but mostly red and orange in a lot of our forests. And as we've seen this summer, that there's the well-intentioned but misguided practice of fire suppression for the last 100 years have turned our local forests into, a tinderbox that, especially in dry conditions, can cause, not healthy natural fire cycles in the forest, but cause, ecologically and for human impacts, devastating, stand clearing forest fires that don't just burn underbrush and small trees, but take down, the old growth trees and clear everything to the ground. And so there's a need for, some solution to that, and biomass potentially can play a role in supporting that work. I think one of the concerns that people have sometimes is that if we are relying on biomass for local power, that it's going to encourage people to grow trees or cut down trees just for electricity. The economics of that I don't think are ever going to really be viable in Humboldt County, so I'm not really concerned about that from an ecological standpoint. But that said, I think it's important when we're talking about new projects or new technologies beyond the existing facilities to really make sure that it's the restoration priorities that are kind of motivating when we're looking at a new energy project, and not just saying, oh, let's be the energy nerds and build a new power plant and then say, oh, well, we're going to have to get this material, and not that that would be economically viable anyway, but I think it's important, and I think it's a valid concern for people to say, oh, we want to make sure that whatever we're doing, if we're relying on wood products, that it's truly waste and it's truly supporting restoration activities. So that's an area where there could be more development locally. Another neat possibility for doing a CCA program locally is what's called a feed-in tariff for small renewable generation projects, which is another horrible name for a really cool thing. And it's a process or a strategy that Germany really popularized, and they're always the people that they always hold Germany up as the example, because they're like, they've got nowhere near as much sun as California, but they've got all this solar. But what it basically means is that for small projects, they'll provide a fixed tariff, rate schedule. They'll buy power at a competitive rate that's sort of economically encouraging for small renewable projects that feed extra power into the grid. And so, for example, let's say you've got some rancher that has a large roof on his barn, and he's got a dairy manure pond, and he wants to do a large solar array, and he wants to do a dairy waste digester, but it's going to produce more electricity than he consumes at his site. Right now, if you try to sell that to PG&E, it's not really it's a non-starter from an economic standpoint, and it's a complicated process. And so what a feed-in tariff says, hey, if you want to feed that into the grid, we'll give you a straightforward contract with a competitive price, and that's something you can take to the bank. And so as a small farmer or a business or whatever, whoever you are, you can say, oh, I can build this 2 megawatt project or this 1 megawatt project and overproduce, and I can get this rate for it. I can go to a bank and say, hey, will you give me a loan to do this? And Germany saw that really kind of motivate small-scale distributed generation. And one of the things about CCAs is that they have flexibility. So Sonoma, right out of the gate, said, we're going to do a feed-in tariff for small generators. We're going to give them 9 or 10 cents a kilowatt hour, and they just have to sign on the dotted line, and we'll buy up to a certain amount that we can put into our mix, and still afford it. And and they're done. If PG&E wanted to do that, it would take them probably like 3 years of rate cases at the CPUC. And they'd have to want to do it, and and there's just a lot of barriers to those things where a CCA can just say, hey, we want to do it. In a matter of months, they can say, here's a new program, and roll that out. And so that kind of flexibility, that's just one example, and I think it's an exciting one because it really does have that potential to sort of stimulate small distributed generation projects, not just utility scale large projects, at a wider scale and a sort of a broader potential. And it's a neat example from Sonoma that we can copy and transport here. And so one thing that people have asked is kind of like, oh, does PG&E dislike this, or is PG&E not going to have money to support fixing power lines? And so I'll say PG&E doesn't necessarily like it. I'm not going to belabor that point. They originally put up quite a fight in Marin. They've backed off from that and said, hey, we're going to cooperate, and they've got new leadership all the way up to their CEO is a different person. I would say the local folks who work with PG&E have been very supportive, and PG&E has been actually a really great partner on some of the more innovative things like the RePower Humboldt project, the microgrid project that HSU and the Rancheria are doing out in Blue Lake. They're a key partner on that, And so it seems like they're really kind of starting to make a shift to realizing that maybe we might have to change our business model from what we were doing for the last 100 years. And I think it was a CPUC commissioner that put it well, and he said, utilities can either be partners in change or they can be victims of change, and that the world with Tesla batteries, and there's a lot of different things that are in the cost of solar coming down, that it's a changing world, and I think PG&E is acknowledging that both in the way they've been interacting with people that are moving these things forward recently. And then I put up this quote because they had a flyer that said, they're transitioning to a grid of things, which I think is some reference to some quote about the Internet of Things. But what they meant by that was that, with smart grid technology and, distributed generation and solar, really moving away from this model of like, here's a centralized power plant that's burning stuff out somewhere and it's sending electrons to some place, and it's a very linear one-way system of having a much more dynamic grid. And I think one of the examples they said, someday you might be over-generating solar on your house and selling it to your neighbor to charge their electric car, and it's all automated and you're not sitting there, writing checks to each other. It's just happening through, dynamics and controls set up in the grid infrastructure. And so I think it seems like they're really starting to see that as, an opportunity for them, and not that they're necessarily going to let go of the generation component of it, but they're separate cost centers for them. And like I said before, it's like HSU doesn't buy power from them. Doesn't mean they don't want to work with HSU, and those other states that have CCA programs, their infrastructure hasn't collapsed and people haven't had their power go out, and that there's not any real structural reason that you can't have generation and the transmission distribution be separate, and there's potentially incentives to have them be separate. So I think sometimes people kind of bring up CCA as like, let's kick PG&E out, and CCA can't exist without PG&E. So we could try to municipalize and say, oh, we're going to have to fix the power lines, and we're going to eminent domain and buy out the infrastructure or something, which I certainly don't want to be the one that has to deal with that. And so really for a community choice program to work, it requires PG&E and their grid. And so I think looking at them as hopefully partners, and hopefully they'll look at it the same way to say, hey, let's try to innovate. And yeah, we need the grid to be able to do this. And how do we make sure that that's being upgraded and maintained, and that shouldn't be tied to where the power is coming from. And so hopefully it's going to be an opportunity to kind of push the boundary with them and say, hey, we want to really explore how we can go above and beyond what's been done before. And so far it seems like they're interested in kind of being our partners and saying, hey, let's try new things. Let's move things forward. So I'm going to get into a couple wonky detailed slides just because I know the folks from the Schatz lab would be sad if I didn't have a few numbers up here. And so this is the 2015-2016 budgets for Marin and Sonoma. And this is kind of a reference slide for the next one, which has a lot of numbers on it. And so if you look at kind of the mix of power, and this is after those rate savings that they've achieved, there's a big chunk of it that's basically the cost of the energy. And there's different things that different, you can get count for that a little bit different as far as the scheduling and different components of it. But overall, basically the way that they're accounting for it is saying, hey, this is what it's costing to get our energy. Here's our operations piece, which is staff and consultants, et cetera, and then they're building up reserve funds for like a rate relief fund. So you've got a financial reserve if you ever want to build new projects or put money back into the system to mitigate cost fluctuations. I think the Sacramento Municipal Utility District just put out like $300 million or something out of their reserve fund to stabilize rates because they had such a drop in hydropower production that they were going to have prices spike, and so they took that reserve fund and said, okay, let's buffer the consumer from that spike. And so that's something that local governments can prioritize and do. And so the percentages are a little different here. And as I mentioned before, Marin's got 50% renewables, and Sonoma's kind of taken a different approach in 33. They also have kind of different types of renewables, and there's other reasons why there's different approaches that they've kind of customized to their objectives. But as you can see, that the 80 to 90% is the energy cost itself, and then you've got in the 10% range is the operations, and then there's some flux depending on what contracts you have for building up a reserve fund, which would profit, but it's obviously not profit if it's a government agency that doesn't. It's just going to be put either to programs or it's going to be put to a reserve. So, and here's the one with lots of numbers on it. So this is kind of a back of the envelope calculation for Humboldt County. And so I'll just kind of walk through. Let's see if I can figure out the laser pointer. So so there's two columns here, and it's the cost per megawatt hour, so kind of just the unit cost for different items. And then if we assume, and this is actually assuming more like a 10% opt-out, which is what Sonoma's actually, I think, seeing 8% opt-out. So when people got the rate comparison and it said, oh, it's going to be a lot cheaper, people said, oh, okay. So this is based off of 10%, so it's a little bit different than the number I popped up before, and I'll talk about that in a second. And so if we say, hey, we want to have $2 million in rate savings across the community, so let's just subtract that out. And so this is PG&E's sort of base cost for the generation components, like $95 a megawatt hour. If we say we want to have rate savings because we need to be competitive, that brings us down to like 92 megawatt hours, sort of a budget of like, that's what the revenue would be if we're charging, the customer base, this price below what PG&E prices are to achieve this rate savings. So if you go down and say, well, okay, what does that buy us? Sort of the average cost of minimum power requirements is like $53 a megawatt hour. And again, these are, there's a lot of variables in this, and these are very back of the envelope numbers. But that includes kind of, peak power, off-peak power. We're pretty level as far as our loads around here. There's, various capacity charges and things that kind of roll into that. And that also kind of includes just the very bare minimum of, sort of renewable energy standards. And, so you're maybe looking at something like that to just kind of, hit the lowest threshold you could hit for power procurement. And then you've got your, operations and financing. So, obviously we're not going to be sitting on, $60 million. So there's going to have to be some financing. And so, looking at that, it's like maybe, $7 to $10, a megawatt hour. And, these are kind of what that pencils out to across the board and what kind of percentage of here's what our rate base is that we can work with. So we've got that. This power charge and difference adjustment is basically a fee that PG&E charges, which the amount is kind of, there's not, I think it's somewhat picked out of the air of what exactly that should be. And there's some debate about that amount. But that's basically the fee that's charged because PG&E has contracted for power, and they've got short and long range contracts. And so, for example, in Sonoma County, they had contracts that were going to supply that power for that rate base of customers in Sonoma. And so when those customers opt out, they still have a contractual obligation. They've got this contract in hand that says, oh, we own X number of megawatt hours for the next X number of years through this contract that we were going to be providing these guys with, and they're required to have those in place, to make sure that they're able to deliver power to customers and, not have people's lights go out. And so if they can't sell that power back and they lose money on it because the prices have gone down since they contracted for it, basically it's set up so that the rest of the PG&E ratepayers aren't impacted by that CCA starting up, and that's where it's like indifference. So it's like, Humboldt County ratepayers or San Francisco ratepayers or Oakland ratepayers, when Marin customers opted out, didn't get stuck with the bill for that liability of that contract. And so, that's a variable amount and could be debated and what exactly should it be and what will it be over time, since obviously it's a short-term kind of piece, and then, they didn't contract for power forever. And so, but, right now it's 9 something, I think, 9.6 or something a megawatt hour. These numbers are rounded up. And so your kind of base cost of what you can't really get out of, these things are all kind of like, that's just, what you're going to need to deal with is, somewhere in that $71 a megawatt hour range, or, 77% of kind of the total that you've got. And so that kind of leaves you with this $22 or, 23% that you've got some, what do you do with that, since you can't really get out of these things? And so, the local biomass plants are, somewhere in the range of, $90 to $100 a megawatt hour. And that's similar to also what, if we were doing other local generation, like that's what the Feedin Tariff for Sonoma is for small scale generation. And so if you're saying, hey, we want to have a chunk of power that's local, and you can just see that's, so I just basically added the additional cost above whatever that base power we would have been buying is going to cost us $42 more per megawatt hour to get local power. And, assuming this is, again, assuming all 3 plants are up and running, you're going to have, a pretty hefty chunk that's, being taken up by that amount. And so that's going to leave maybe 3% left over for like a net to your reserve fund or whatever you want to do after that. And so, on the one hand, that's, a hefty chunk of, dollars, but that's also, that combined with, the part that would be up here, that's going to be like $30 million a year that's staying in the local economy for local truck drivers and local mills and, local workers at the power plants. And so there's, that's $30 million of economic activity in our community that has ripple effects that we'd be keeping locally. And I also bring this up because if you actually add this together with that, that's about where, getting this 50%, that's kind of in the range of what Marin's at, and they're doing about 3% to their reserve. So it puts us potentially in the same ballpark. Now, that's where I'd say the devil's in the details. So these are, a set of assumptions, but there's a lot of challenges in there. And so, for example, the price of PGE's price could go down, and I think it's actually expected to go down next year. Partly I think due to some lag times, and so if you're kind of trying to compete with that price, you don't have control over that, and that could go down while the price of the other power that you're buying are local renewables, and the price of the general grid mix power can go up. And right now this is a pretty historically low number due to sort of the fracking natural gas boom, and so that's somewhat of an inflated number. There's a lot of variables. What are new state requirements going to do to the price? How is cap and trade going to affect it? When is that natural gas price? It's going to go up, but how fast is it going to go up? Is there going to be things that impact that? And a lot of the prices are kind of tied to that natural gas price. And so right now, some of those big rate savings, Sonoma's squirreling away like $16 million a year into their reserve. That's enabled by the pretty historically low prices, which play into this price. So it's not, PG&E isn't unaffected by those things, but those are variables that you change a couple numbers here, and then this number doesn't work out so much, and so it doesn't take a lot of variation to shift that. Another piece of that is this number, which is subject to regulatory. The CPUC ultimately decides what that is, and if they come up with a favorable number, it drops that down. If they come up with an unfavorable number, it raises that up. And again, you can say, oh, you bump that a little bit, and that's not, there's not a huge margin right there. And so the direction of any of these things can fluctuate. And then from a local standpoint, the political will of the community. So this was assuming a 10% opt-out rate. If I drop that down to 20%, then this number is not, balanced. You lose a chunk right here, and you still, if you're trying to get all three facilities into your mix, this number's not changing, and and then this goes into a negative number. And so, so that requires, one, that all of our communities opt into the program so that we have a large customer base, and two, it requires that individual community members and businesses choose to participate in the program, and that we have a lower opt-out rate if we are going to kind of go for this local power premium that we want to try to hit. So that's where I say the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of numbers here that if you shift them a little bit, you can say, it doesn't pencil out, or we can only work with one facility or two facilities locally. And so there's going to be a lot of work to kind of see what we can make work, and then also figure out how can we mitigate risk in the long run, and have procurement strategies that help hedge against those risks that we might be undertaking. So where we're at in next steps is, we're governed, our CEA is governed by a joint powers agreement between the county and all the cities. And so we're looking at modifications to that would basically enable a CCA approach, and that'll probably include, potentially a weighted voting structure, a little bit more based off of energy loads, because, like the city of Trinidad has 300 people, and the county has like almost 60% of the population, and they have the same vote right now on our city board. And so we're looking at adjusting that, and that's what Sonoma and Marin have done, is have a weighted voting structure for decision making and rate setting. And then each jurisdiction has to pass an ordinance to opt into the program. So even if our CEA says we're doing it, City of Eureka as a community still has to, the city council has to say, all right, we're going to pass this ordinance and we are going to participate in our CEA's program. Again, just because the City of Eureka or the City of Arcadia opts into it, they still can, individual customers can still opt out. So just because Arcadia says we're part of it, Joe Sixpack or Wildberries can say, hey, we want to, not be a part of this, I'm going to stick with PG&E. But the next step is the cities have to say, yeah, we want our community to have that choice, and so that's take some building consensus and working with the community. And we're going to be doing, I think, a series of kind of community workshops. So I've been doing presentations at all the city councils, but we're also going to do some kind of more open, less formal forums where people can come and ask questions and hear what it's all about. I'm sure if you walked up to 9 or 99 out of 100 people on the street, and said, what's CCA and what do you think of it? They'd say, what the heck are you talking about? So, it's starting to be in the paper a little bit more, and and I think there's starting to be more awareness. But I think we've got a ways to go to make people fully understand what it is and why we would want to do it. I think continuing discussions with local facilities and saying, hey, how do we work with you guys and how do we make this pencil out, and let's try to move that forward in parallel, because that's a time-sensitive issue. And then selecting service providers, I had that operations piece. Marin Sonoma don't do all this stuff in-house with staff, and certainly we're going to be looking at hiring a team of experts, and not just local folks, but working with companies that have experience and capacity to take on this kind of work, because it's not simple. I kind of said, oh, here's the numbers, but it's like you get into the details of scheduling and hedging and looking at forward projections of power, and so there's a lot of people that do this. There's, like I said, there's 1,000 CCAs across the country, so it's not like it's something that can't be done, but it's something that rather than trying to do some accelerated ramp up locally and say, oh, let's become experts on this and try to hire a bunch of staff. I think we're really going to be looking at working with companies that can do that. And, there's certain components of it, the software for scheduling the power and, call centers for opt-outs. It's like, okay, if 7,000 people call to opt out, who are they calling? Who's answering the phone? And is that ringing in our office? And so we're going to be doing a request for proposals for, a company or a team of companies to help implement this, and hopefully, really looking at trying to get this going by 2016 and rolling it out at an accelerated pace pretty soon. And I should mention, as we're moving this forward, there's sort of off ramps. So there's going to be a point when the city councils will have to say, yes, we want to opt into it. But really, a key point is you're going to have some projections, but at some point there's going to be this moment when you say, here's your power prices. Here's what we can get from local facilities. Here's what we can get in the open market. And is that going to be a competitive rate with PG&E? And that's kind of a key no-go decision. And so there's things we've got to do to get to that point. There's a lot of work before you actually can say, here's what the rate will be. Here's what's going to get mailed out to people if we sign these contracts. Do we want to sign these power contracts? So we're working towards that goal. There's a few steps, quite a few steps to go in there. And sort of solidifying some of those priorities, like what are our the goals for local renewables, but we're moving forward hopefully with those things really in parallel. Our next board meeting is September 21st for RCEA, and we're hoping to have the JPA agreement modifications and hopefully the ordinance template and the RFP for service providers ready by that meeting so that they can approve that and we can kind of keep the momentum going. And so, it's all pretty complicated, and kind of coming back to that beginning piece of it, it's like, it's kind of a daunting thing to say, hey, can we be an example for, California and the rest of the world of what a local community can really do to push the envelope around local renewables and local sustainable energy. And, there's a lot of complicated pieces in this, and, sometimes I kind of wonder, like, gosh, we really want to do this, and it's a lot of work. But, I think really coming back to the RePower Humboldt plan, it's technically feasible to supply our community with local renewables. And so it's really, can we motivate ourselves, and can we do the hard work to get there? And, I always like to put up Pogo, who commented on environmental issues, and he said, we've met the enemy, and he is us. And really, so just like climate change is something that, sometimes it's daunting because it's this global problem that it's a result of our own, consumption of resources. There's the opportunity to say, hey, let's step up to that challenge and really, try to embrace it and say, hey, we can beat this, and we can do it in a way that brings prosperity to our community, and really from that, context, there's a lot of risks in there, and I was, the devil's really in the details of the numbers, and do we want to try to do that? But, I kind of look at it of like, you look at coral bleaching and, the impacts of these things and the economic impacts of dependence on oil, and, it's like, it's risky and we might fail, but, really, like, failure isn't an option in this case, and so it's up to us to really try, and, if we can't do it in Humboldt County, and we can't, like, be an example in Humboldt County, I don't have a lot of hope for the rest of the world being able to step up to this challenge, since I think we've got more commitment and more capacity than most communities our size, certainly, and many across the country and across the world. So I think we're looking forward to the challenge and to really roll up our sleeves and get going on this project. So that's where we're at with community choice aggregation. At it across the state, but it's not a business that people have been in. So there's been a couple companies, both one's called California Clean Power, another one's called Community Choice Partners, which ironically have the same acronym, which makes it harder to speak of them efficiently. But that are offering kind of turnkey solutions and saying, hey, we'll kind of provide the soup to nuts, and and a big part of what I think is an appeal of that is the notion, because there's startup costs involved in this. You've got to send 3 opt-out mailers to every customer, and dealing with a lot of the initial power procurement and getting the software systems. There's a bunch of costs that are up front that are there before you actually start having customers send you a check every month, and so and they don't send the check to you, they send it to PG&E, and then PG&E sends you your part of it. So I think the companies that are starting to kind of emerge have said, oh, that's a pretty big barrier, and so the meat of it is really the operation side of it, and so they're kind of pitching to say, hey, we'll help you with the startup costs, we'll take on a lot of that work up front so that you don't have to eat that cost, and then we'll make it up on on having a contract for operations. There's a couple companies that have kind of pitched that model. One's been a little bit more, proactive about pitching their services to the local community, and I think there's, they kind of have changed their model too. They kind of had this guaranteed rate thing, and they're stepping away from that and just kind of saying, hey, we'll be a fee for service, and you'll pay us X amount per megawatt hour per customer, and that's what we'll do to operate it, and so they're kind of presenting themselves as a one-stop shop. The other company that's stepped forward to kind of reach out, Community Choice Partners, is a new company themselves, but they've got a team of about 7 companies that are kind of have been doing CCA call centers and did scheduling software for the California Independent System Operator. And so rather than trying to build up all that capacity just in one new company, they've kind of said, hey, we'll kind of put the team together, but we've got this team of 7 companies that have a broader, deeper experience of doing this in other situations. Some of them are doing stuff with maybe Sonoma, I think, or Marin, but for municipal utilities or for utilities, just investor-owned utilities, and so building on that kind of capacity. That said, I think I'm hopeful that when we put out our RFP for services, we won't just get 2 responses. And I think there's some other companies that do this kind of work in other states, or that are seeing kind of the opportunity and maybe work with municipal utilities and say, hey, we could put something together that would be responsive to a CCA program. And so I'm hopeful that we'll at least get 3 or maybe 4 responses to that, of people that are putting together either one company or a team of companies that can say, here's the package of services. But and I think we want to keep the RFP focused on do you really have the capacity to do all the things that you need to do to implement this, but also leave a little bit of flexibility for different approaches to that, not just kind of pick a winner by structuring it to say, oh, you've got to do X, Y, and Z, and only one company's built that model, because it is a new kind of realm, and so there isn't a ton of California businesses that are saying, hey, we'll be your turnkey or provider. And I think that's also, they've all kind of agreed that there's certain things that local governments might want to take on more and more of as time goes on, and so getting out of the gate quick, it helps to work with people that have experience, but then over time you can say, oh, let's take on this piece and that piece, and kind of integrate more of it locally as well. I don't know if that fully answers your question, or yeah.
Can you go back to your dollar consent slide?
Yeah.
So two questions. One, I guess I'm assuming that the PG&E, the cost, the distribution and customer costs, et cetera, that's just above the
Yeah, it's a different, yeah. Okay. This is just the generation side of it, so okay. It's a different.
So then, this biomass cost premium, the differential there between the whatever 95 and 53, that's a little bit terrifying. And the argument that you made earlier about, well, PG&E as a regulated monopoly isn't nimble, they have no incentive to be efficient, to bring down costs, etc. That works for me on we can be 5 or 7% cheaper. But how do you reconcile your power being, almost, like 80% more expensive than what they're seeing as a base? And I recognize they also have to buy renewables, which might be more expensive than the minimum power requirements. But
Yeah.
I don't see how that works out.
And so, I think these are kind of current numbers, and so again, that's and PG&E also doesn't necessarily have current contracts, and there's folks in this room that probably could answer this some of these questions better than me that operate a biomass plant, but it's not that they're getting they've got a mix of resources, and so it's like desert solar isn't that amount, and and so it is a question of how much do you want to sort of eat up that flexibility. And so if you're trying to just say, hey, we want to maximize rate savings, and that's kind of what utilities in Illinois are doing, and just saying, hey, let's just try to hit this number and just walk away from it. And so that that could be the decision point. Like I said, that's also a really high percentage of local renewables from something that isn't necessarily the cheapest resource from a statewide standpoint, happens to be one of the key resources we have. And so again, that's maxing it out and saying, hey, do we want to go with all three facilities? If you say, well, maybe it's Scotia and Fairhaven, or or Blue Lake and Fairhaven, then that becomes a lot more sort of manageable number. And and so again, when you look at Marin and Sonoma's pieces of the pie as well, they're looking at having 100% renewable option that has a premium, and that's 100% geyser power, and so I mean, I guess it just comes down to what the priority is, because you can just go for big rate savings. You could say, oh, well, let's go and buy large hydro, that's only a couple bucks more than the sort of base power cost, and and sort of that doesn't meet state renewable portfolio standards. So I guess it's a question of priorities of do we want to do rate savings or do we want to do local renewables, and it's a large premium, and PG&E is certainly paying that for some of their power, and and as the low-hanging fruits of renewables aren't necessarily going to continue to be there, as far as easy to build wind sites, for example. But it's not going to be easy if that's what we want to go with. But yep.
Kevin, just to follow, I'm not sure. Is the question that you were asking? So it starts with $95 per megawatt hour at the top, and then you kind of work through it, and we'll end up with this $22 per megawatt hour. The 42 is applied to
the portion of it that's biomass. Yeah.
50%, so that kind of essentially chews up the rest of it. But you're asking why is it 22? 22 is about 20% lower.
The 95 that I was mentioning was the 42 plus the 53 average minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was saying. If you are paying this biomass cost premium, i.e., it's $95 a megawatt hour for that power, because that's how much.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
So how do you reconcile that you're going to be paying $95 a megawatt hour for that power, where the base power is $53 a megawatt hour, and you're still going to pass on a cost savings? I don't want to get too bogged down.
Yeah, but it does. I mean, it comes down to what your priorities are, because as you're saying, hey, we don't mind having because that's 80% or so mystery meat power that's natural gas and whatever sort of left over on the grid, and excess nuclear, whatever it is, you don't even know what a lot of it is. It's just it's mystery meat power. And so if you want to have 80% mystery meat power, you can say, oh, let's get it super cheap. And so that's kind of the question, is that's not the priority that the local community so far, at least the ones that are my bosses, have set. But I think there's a balance point there, and and that might be a decision point to say, you know what, why don't we shift some of that over to more local programs, or let's shift it over to more rate savings. And so, saying, hey, we're going to have half of it be at 100 megawatt hour or 95, is, yeah.
A question on the biomass CO2 production. The idea that biomass is renewable has always been something I understand. Given how much CO2 is produced, how long does it take for it to get renewed in order that it can be considered renewable? And is that consistent with the concept that we're trying to go to a low CO2?
Yeah, and that's a valid question. Obviously, you're burning a material, and it's not a fossil fuel material, so that's, it's still going into the atmosphere and it's part of the cycle, but and so it has an impact there. And so there's not no impact. Right now, biomass is considered an eligible renewable source. I think there's various states are kind of approaching it differently as far as how do you quantify that, and where do you, is it from waste products that's going to get burned anyway? Like, okay, if it's stuff that Green Diamond has to burn out in the woods, then you're not changing that balance by not using it. You're just, having worse air quality. And I bet Angie over in the corner could answer some of that question better, because she's with the Watershed Research and Training Center and does a lot of work on the statewide biomass group.
I just think an important thing to point out a lot of the conversation is that a lot of the biomass that does end up in large-scale power plants is biomass that would have been disposed of in a different way anyhow. And as Matthew said earlier, actually, so like Green Diamond, when they can't get their biomass hauled to a biomass power plant, they burn it in the woods. So it's a carbon source anyway, and if it can be a carbon source that also offsets fossil fuel, then we're doing better as a county than we would be.
And that's kind of which would you rather have? Which disease would you rather have? Approach. But I think Green Diamond also has a lot of land, and there are companies, American wind power companies, that are looking to put wind power on some of these unused or infrequently used open spaces. That I think is something that the CCA could pursue and be more effective over the long term in terms of making this a low CO2 producing county. And I think that's really where a lot of people have come from in terms of pursuing and supporting the CCA.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if biomass, increasing the amount of biomass that we're actually burning, because it isn't the most effective. And I just looked at the numbers, it's actually almost as bad as coal in terms of producing CO2.
That really depends on who you ask and how you do your math.
Right.
This could be a whole other talk.
Yeah, this is something that many of us look at pretty closely, and Angie's not wrong on this. I mean, if that material is part of forestry slash, so it's a tree that's being cut down to build buildings, and there's fully half of the biomass on that tree isn't being made into lumber, and if they're going to pile that in the field and they're going to burn it because they are obligated to, because otherwise it's a forest fire risk, then that emits black carbon, it emits methane, it emits all sorts of stuff. So if you can mobilize that out of the field and burn it more efficiently and cleaner in a power plant, and so doing offset fossil energy, then you can have a net negative greenhouse gas on a net life cycle basis. So it really, I mean, there's a lot of strong language out there about biomass power, and there's a lot of misinformation on both sides of the coin. And I think it's important that we take this sort of an empirical look at it.
And one thing I didn't elaborate on, which is, I think, of note, that probably our in the long run a huge potential resource locally is there's some onshore wind, but our offshore wind and like wave energy potential is the best, like on the West Coast and potentially the country. We've got a very significant resource. We obviously have a fairly underutilized port, and the harbor districts, buying the former mill site. There's onshore infrastructure that's right there, and so there's certainly, that's less proven technology, but if we're talking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years out, that's a pretty to be determined, but a significant, from just a pure capacity angle, that's like a potentially a huge resource that could be tapped into. There's
maybe have been looking at
You mean as far as like out of the area, yeah, there's certainly, you know, there's a range of options, and I think the focus recently has been, you know, like I said, on the sort of the local side of it, because of the, you know, the economic, you know, jobs impact of like it like hurts the economics of the mills to have to truck their waste to Reading and Anderson, you know, and you know there's businesses that, you know, there's a guy that does activated carbon and, you know, creates, you know, for water filtration and exports that, and he uses the waste product from the biomass plants. And you know, I was talking with him and he's like, yeah, you know, I used to have more staff and I'm having to scale back because I don't, you know, there's not enough material for me to operate my business. And so, you know, there's direct kind of jobs and economic benefits, you know, well beyond just kind of the energy side of it, from having, you know, a shortage of facilities to deal with that waste product. So that's kind of been the front and center issue. You know, just, I mean, to be frank, it's like, yeah, if that didn't work out, it would pencil out a lot better, but that's not, you know, the goal isn't to make a bunch of money for our reserve fund, you know, so that's where it's like, okay, well, you know, what are our priorities? And so, you know, it's a challenge to try to balance that out. And so to some extent, it's like, it gets a little bit easier if we were saying, oh, you know, we're scaling back on the local renewables, or, you know, that doesn't work out, then there's more wiggle room there. But again, you know, is that our goal, just to, you know, have a little bit cheaper prices than PG&E? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, and that's, I think, you know, going back to the whole risk management strategy of, you know, figuring out what are the odds that something's not going to work out, and, you know, what kind of, you know, hedges do you have against that, and how are you kind of strategizing, and what's the rest of your mix, and, you know, and how's that structured so that you're not, you know, and that's where, you know, hiring people that do that for a living with, you know, that have PhDs and spend, you know, 60 hours a week figuring that stuff out is helpful to have on your team. Yeah.
So I think you touched on this briefly, that CCA can also have local efficiency programs, or local programs for both renewable generation or efficiency programs, and that kind of intrigues me, partly for the local control component, and also that we're somewhat of a unique region, and so efficiency here is something that, you know, we can participate in statewide efficiency programs that exist, but they may not make sense in this region. So that's interesting, and it can just be part of our economic development. And so my question to tie to that is, in the RePower Humboldt analysis or in the Abyss analysis, do you have a sense of the relative magnitude or importance of efficiency and the end goal of the you know, is that 2% or 5%?
Yeah, and it's, I think, you know, it's typically the most cost-effective resource is efficiency, you know, and so to the extent that you can, you know, maximize that, you know, I don't remember off the top, but Jim might remember what the number that the model kind of maxed out at, but I think it was just whatever we set in like the top threshold. But
I think in a couple of scenarios we looked at, I want to say it was 5, 10%, something like that. It wasn't 20 or 30, but it was substantial.
And even that's significant. But if you pushed it to 20 or 30, there might be a whole other way of looking at, well, what's our local renewable? Are we putting that money into local economic development and biomass plants, or putting it into local efficiency installation and research and program?
And you know, a challenge around that is that, like, efficiency implementation can be pretty like gritty work, and you know, even at the state, so like the state is investing, you know, about $1 billion a year in energy efficiency programs, you know, across the state, you know, through PG&E and the other utilities. You know, we get about, you know, 1.3 or so million of that for local programs, but finding cost-effective projects is kind of tricky, you know, and it's like, it's literally sort of a door-to-door effort, and you can have different kinds of things like financing, you know, and we're working on getting, you know, PACE rolled out across the whole county, and, you know, there's certainly the potential to do things like on-bill financing through a CCA program where you might be able to really have some enabling strategies. So I guess I would say, you know, there's probably, I mean, you know, you could have 10%, 20% efficiency that, you know, could be cost effective. Getting to that savings, like, can be pretty tricky. You know, it's like, it's one thing to do on paper, and it's another thing to go to, you know, the 3,000 residents of Rio Del and try to actually get 20% savings in each one of their houses, across the board, or to work with, the 30,000 businesses in the county and actually say, okay, let's implement that. And so I think, we work on that on a daily basis, but I think the state's actually struggling with that, of even just making the $1 billion they're spending on that a year cost effective from a ratepayer standpoint, because once you went from incandescents to CFLs, there's kind of like the low-hanging fruit's gone, and then you're kind of having to do much more comprehensive projects, and it's more costly, and there's more transaction costs. So the state's kind of even trying to retool how they're spending money on efficiency, because they're struggling to make it viable from a ratepayer standpoint as far as cost effectiveness. That said, the state makes it about as complicated as you could possibly make it, and so that's one of the advantages of if we had a local program, you could cut through a lot of, we literally just got a request for 40 TPS reports from PG&E, and it's a TPS report, like that's the acronym. I don't even remember what it stands for. It's if you've ever seen Office Space. But, so the CPUC says, oh, we're going to do this verification, and we need you guys. So it's going to take like our staff like 3 weeks to, fill out a bunch of forms to prove that, this was the savings that was achieved. And again, not that it's all for good reasons up the food chain somewhere, but there's a lot of bureaucracy in the state system. So if we had our own pot of money, we could just say, hey, you know what, we're going to do this program, and we don't have to calculate the TRC and the PAC, and we could just do this. And so I think, that would certainly be, I think, a priority of looking at how we could use this as a vehicle for more efficiency and more distributed generation and demand side management. And those things might actually even be critical from a cost standpoint, of you're kind of like, oh, you got this tight margin, but if you can start doing creative things like demand side management and other things that add value to what you're providing to customers, and that's bringing in, kind of a revenue base that's adding value that, isn't dependent on just buying electrons or building power plants. So, yeah.
Wonky question, but in terms of our requirements for the independent system operator and the impacts on the grid of putting in particularly renewables that may have less predictable production, how much does that limit our options for choosing where electricity comes from? So, like, for example, if all of Marin County opted to pay the premium for 100% renewable, would the independent system operator start jumping in and saying, wait a second?
Yeah, I mean, so you have to be, balancing out your load, and so there is, you can't just say like, oh, look, we just bought a bunch of solar and we're done. It's actually got to be dialed in, so that the whole scheduling process is like, way above my pay grade as far as like the systems to kind of manage that at the grid level and how that, works out. And then, being a sort of a transmission constrained area, there's actually, like congestion charges, that's the term for getting power in and out of the, the county. And so, like, for example, when Blue Lake was operating and selling to San Diego Gas and Electric, there's costs associated with kind of, that. And then again, I would say that's, above my pay grade. Bob Marino probably could tell you exactly what it is to send power out of the.
San Diego, the power was in fact used here locally.
Yeah.
So, as a energy provider or generator, we don't really care where it goes. Whether it's going to San Diego, or San Diego is getting credit for it or not. You stimulate a lot of questions up here to me. I appreciated the comments that you made about biomass and your comments too. It is recognized as being a very expensive product. One of the advantages to utilizing local biomass in a CCA here in Humboldt would be your transmission. There would be little, if any, transmission loss. So that's another thing to consider too.
Yep.
And along those lines, if we start producing more energy here and using our own energy here, will our transmission costs on the other side of PG&E's bill, will that be reflected in that? Will those go down?
I would say not, and again, there's the full setup. It wouldn't be, I mean, that's a fixed, cost that I think is sort of levelized, across all their rate base, which frankly is probably in our favor, because I'm sure when, there's a winter storm up here and like West Havens has like 2 miles of down power lines and they're sending up trucks from Sonoma, we're probably getting a deal on what our transmission maintenance costs would be, and it's probably being subsidized by people in Oakland and San Francisco that are paying the same prices as we are for our miles and miles of rural power lines. So, but that said, I think there is the transmission losses, and for some of the scheduling and assurance pieces of like the power procurement piece of it, there's costs that, if you are, not trying to get power into the area or out of the area, that, you can have some efficiency gains there and potentially cost gains there.
We're already in a reasonably good situation from that perspective. There's not that much that comes in and out. Already is on the order of 20%. Typically, because most of it is generated either by the local biomass plant or by the local gas plant.
I'm fascinated along with what you were just saying, Arnie. I think if this question about, let's say we do a CCA, and if we are able to buy power from the local biomass plants, 2 or 3 of them, let's say it's 3 of them that would provide 50% of our roughly 50 or was yeah.
It was about 15. 2014 was a really low energy use year, so that's, I think, that's where that's a conservative number maybe, but
if we did that, and then the rest of that power would have to come from other sources. If we didn't buy power from those local biomass plants, and let's say a couple of them shut down and one of them keeps selling to PG&E, so the one that's still selling to PG&E is still generating locally, it's still serving our local demand. It seems to me that the resource that's going to change physically in terms of generating more or less locally is going to be the natural gas power plant. Right? Because I mean, we can only import so much. We can't import all the electricity we need, and they're probably. I guess they could import more, but basically using more or less. I think that's what we've seen for as those biomass plants are going offline. We're not importing 2 or 3 times as much electricity. We're producing more at the local natural gas power plant. Is that?
yeah, and the way that the Cal ISO operates things is pretty Byzantine as far as where your price is reconciled, and like I said, I don't claim to have a complex understanding of it, but and that's I think where the physical resource is like so it's like the blue light power electrons are going into our local grid,
right.
But if San Diego's buying that or somebody else is buying it, there's costs associated with where your power is coming from and how that's scheduled and what your capacity charges are for and so
Sure. But physically, we have to produce a certain amount of power locally because we can't import it all. And how much if we buy more biomass locally, then that's going to potentially or we don't produce more biomass locally. The local natural gas power plant is probably the main thing that's going to go.
Yeah, I mean, so if we had no local renewables, there'd be some amount of import, and then there would be the local natural gas plant, and which was what the balance of that would be just based off of what the demand was and what the cost at any given moment was. Yep. Yep.
If we're looking at potentially 3 biomass plants in the county, 2 of them are currently under contract to PG&E. How do we segue from a PG&E contract to a CCA?
And
do we have to wait till? I'm throwing that out.
Yeah, no, and that's where we've had a couple conversations in passing about it, and then I've had some more specific conversations with Scotia and Blue Lake about, obviously Blue Lake doesn't have a contract. Scotia technically has a contract, but they're not, they're not operating because it doesn't, they can't make it pencil out, and so they're pretty interested in trying to say, hey, here's what we could get, and so I think, and as I recall, I think, your contract's up in 2017, which is just around the corner, so. No, and so I think it would just be looking to hopefully come in and, in your case in particular, the other two are, Scotia's basically out of theirs pretty soon, I think at the beginning of next year. But yeah. So I think it would just involve, hopefully being ready to go. So having that conversation sooner rather than later. So when you guys are making a decision, you're saying, oh, are we going back over here to, renegotiate with PG&E, or are we going this way? And that's where the sooner we can kind of get to, that sort of launch point, and so it might be signing a contract with you guys to start in 2017, and say, okay, we're going to have a 10-year contract starting once your current contract's up, and that could be in place, obviously, and waiting for the time to switch over. So, yeah. Thank you very much.